Hi everyone, this is a video to take you through how we figure out when aggregate demand or aggregate supply changes, what is the effect on GDP, employment levels, and price levels. This is probably going to be a little bit beyond the first key knowledge point that we're doing here, but it will help you later on in the second half of this outcome when we link through to specific goals. Okay, so your focus for this particular video is the process on how to link changes to aggregate demand and aggregate supply through to those three things down the bottom. All right, so this first video is going to be about aggregate demand, and then there'll be a second aggregate supply video following. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with aggregate demand side factors. So we want to have our behavior here focused on the behavior of consumers. And sometimes, as you can see here, the behavior of consumers is not quite rational. But nonetheless, aggregate demand. Let's remind ourselves what aggregate demand is all about. Aggregate demand is the total expenditure on Australian-made goods and services. All right, now there's this formula that you guys will be saying in your sleep for years to come, with aggregate demand being C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and those particular components are here. So private consumption is C, private investment is I. That word private just means non-government. Yeah, so from a financial or economic perspective, when you see the word public, that refers generally to governments. So, like public spending, for example, would be spending by the government, and private sector is the non-government sector. Okay, so in this instance, private consumption is the consumption by individuals, and private investment is the consumption by businesses. And then we move on to G, which is government expenditure. You don't need to go into G1 and G2. The study design doesn't specify there. And then we have exports and imports. And we take out imports because we only want the expenditure on Australian-made goods and services. So all the expenditure on those imports, we take out of the equation. So that's really important when we're doing our final answers to this, that if your answer is talking about imports increasing, well, that's actually going to cause aggregate demand to actually fall. This is a negative in front of it. All right, so let's get into it. Key ideas here. Okay, so let's talk about price levels. I mentioned earlier this video is mainly about process. So this is going to help you understand the process of how to get from a change to aggregate demand to a change here in price levels. So the key idea here, and what you'll be annotating on questions of this nature, so circling the certain words in the question and annotating. If it's about price levels, then you've got to talk about shortages and surpluses. All right, so what does that mean? Well, any changes to demand inflation, remember we're just doing aggregate demand, any changes to demand inflation are from either economy-wide shortages or surpluses. And if you remember, that concept of a shortage or a surplus is from microeconomics. And we've got a shortage when essentially the price is too low. All right, and a shortage occurs when where demand exceeds supply, and the way we think about that is the shelves are empty with a line of customers out the door. And that same idea can be expanded to the aggregate level, the added up level, where if there are widespread shortages, well, what are suppliers going to do to respond to those shortages? Well, they're going to increase their price. And if lots of suppliers increase their price, then we're going to have that demand inflation. All right, so demand inflation is caused by not enough supply to meet demand. So your reason for why price goes up is down in this bottom box here. So when aggregate demand goes up due to the behavior of consumers, well, price will go up due to the behavior of suppliers. All right, so let's move on to our next idea. So when we're talking about GDP, so your key idea with linking through to changes in GDP is that final letter in GDP is product. So we're talking about production, and this is the key idea. You need to link to a change in production. So any changes to GDP are from either making more or less stuff. Now, what changes how much they make is the level of aggregate demand. And if you remember way back to the start of year 11, where we talked about who is it that ultimately decides what to produce and when, well, it's consumers that do that. And so if consumers purchase more things, well, then producers are going to um, increase their level of production to meet that new level of demand. Okay, so when aggregate demand goes up, we're going to the bottom box here. This is the reason. When aggregate demand goes up, which is the behavior of consumers, well, we're going to see there an increase in production going up because producers will increase their level of output to meet the new level of demand. And then our third key idea here is employment. So this is the idea is it's all about derived demand for labor. And this is the sentence I want to see in all of your responses when you need to link to a change to employment levels. What that word derived means, it kind of means as a result of or coming from, and is about, well, any changes to employment are from either making more or less stuff, and then they're changing labor requirements. So if we make more stuff in the economy, well, we're going to need more people to make that stuff, and therefore there's going to be more people employed. So always link to GDP first when you do anything linking to employment. Think of, when you're linking to employment, think of it as pretty much the same answer as what you would do for GDP, then add on a little extra bit in regards to the derived demand for labor. And the reason for this is in that bottom box. When GDP goes up, e.g. we make more stuff, employment goes up, which is the change to the labor market. So those are really the key ideas. We're going to go through some examples now, okay? Here is the process on how you answer these questions. Most of them are going to be 3 markers. If they're 4 markers, just put more detail in. So the first process is you're going to define, and remember this is aggregate demand, define the relevant aggregate demand factor that has changed, and then state whether it has increased or decreased. That's the first thing you're going to do, and you're going to get a mark for that, because not always in the question will it actually talk about a specific factor, aggregate demand factor from the study design. There'll often be a mark for identifying what factor actually has changed as a result of that economic event. Your second step is you're going to show an effect on a letter of the aggregate demand equation, and then what happens to aggregate demand and why, most importantly. And that why is explaining why that letter has changed based on that economic event that you talked about in step 1. And then step 3 is the effect on the goal in question and why. And then this is where the reasoning, the why, is in that bottom box on the prior slide. And with any of these videos, guys, please feel free, if I'm moving too fast, to pause and go back over that material until you fully understand. So that's the 3 steps in the process of how to link a change in aggregate demand to any of the 3 economic goals. And we're going to go through an example now. So here's a sample question in the top right-hand corner. Explain the effect of a decrease in GDP growth in China has on the level of employment in Australia. 3 marks. Now, GDP growth in China is not in the study design. So you're going to get a mark here for identifying that that this relates to the rate of economic growth overseas of a key trading partner. Okay, so in your example here, we're just going to go through what you would kind of annotate about and plan where your marks are coming from. So that's going to be, you're going to get a mark for making those links. Your second mark is going to come from the letter of the aggregate demand equation. So I want you to make a quick prediction. Which letter is this going to change? And it's a bit of a trick question because it's 2. It's going to change both X and M. And the combination of X and M we call net exports. And net exports is going to fall. You're going to get that plus saying why, well, China's demanding less exports from Australia, is going to get you that second mark. And then third, we need to wrap it all up. We haven't actually answered the question yet. Don't forget, your last mark is always answering the question with a reason why there's that final link in the chain. So what's effect on the goal in question? Well, we're going to reduce the level of unemployment in an economy. Why? Because there is a reduction in the derived demand for labor. This is the fancy economics way of saying, well, we're making less stuff, so therefore we need less people. That's what that derived demand for labor means. Okay, let's go another example. Again, the process, define the relevant aggregate demand factor that has changed, and then say whether it's increased or decreased. You're then going to give an effect on the letter of the aggregate demand equation and why, and then answer the question and why. So, sample question, explain the effect of a decrease in GDP growth in China has on the level of employment in Australia? Oh, that's the same question. All right, so this time, I've just done what my answer would look like. All right, so for this one, I want you to pause the video and go through and see what a full answer here would look like. Okay, we're going to move on to another example. All right, so same process. This time, we're going to read the question and then you're going to pause the video and have a go at how you would plan this question out. So the question is, explain the effect of a decrease in income tax rates has on the level of economic growth. So pause the video and going through that 1, 2, 3 process, I want you to have a go yourself in your exercise book. So pause the video now. Okay, so let's go through the answers. So reading that question, decrease in income tax rates is not in the study design. So we need to actually link it through to what is, and income tax is your clue, as in it is about disposable income. Okay, this is about the behavior of consumers because it's income tax. Your second mark is going to be then linking that through to an increase in consumer spending. All right, and that's why we talk about C and not I here, because it's income tax. Who does income tax, whose behavior does a change in income tax change? Well, it changes the behavior of consumers. So we're going to say that it's going to be a change in C. And why? Well, there's decreased taxes taking less of more of gross income. That's going to then result in an increase in AD. And then our final one here is an increase in GDP. Why? Because producers will increase the level of output to the new level of demand. And that's the sentence I want you to use when you're linking through to a change in economic growth or GDP. Same thing. All right, this one's over to you again. So same process, new question. Explain the effect of a decrease in consumer confidence has on the rate of GDP. So pause the video here and have a go through this process again in your exercise books. All right, let's go. So, is consumer confidence in the study design? Yes, it is. Awesome. All right, so what you're going to do is you're going to define consumer confidence and you're going to tell me whether that's increased or decreased. Well, it's actually gone down here. All right. Okay. So now, mark 2, you're going to show an effect on which letter. So, consumer confidence affects the behavior of consumers. So, you're going to link through to private consumption. And knowing the definition of consumer confidence here will give you your reason why there's a fall in that particular area of spending. And the reason being is, well, if people aren't confident about their future financial prosperity, which is what consumer confidence is, well, then why it actually falls in expenditure is because consumers delay their spending to a later time. You're not going to get a mark, guys, just for saying fall in private consumption, fall in aggregate demand. You have to give reasons why at every link in the chain. And then your final mark is obviously going to result in a fall in GDP, because whenever aggregate demand falls, GDP falls. Why? It's the same answer here, or same reason, sorry. Producers reduce the level of output to the new level of demand. All right, we're going to go one more. On the demand side of the economy, that's your hint if it's in a SAC or an exam to talk about aggregate demand, because it's telling you. Explain the effect of an appreciation of the AU exchange rate has on price levels or inflation. So pause the video here, have a go. All right, here we go. Is exchange rates in the study design? Yes, it is. All right, so you're going to get a mark for essentially saying what that actually means. What does an appreciation of the exchange rate mean? What means the Australian dollar is getting stronger? Second mark is going to be a letter of the AD equation. So you're going to go in fall in net exports. And here there's 2 reasons. Because Australian exports are relatively more expensive and our imports are relatively cheaper. So that's going to result in a fall in aggregate demand. And then your final link in the chain is that's going to result in a fall in the rate of inflation because economy-wide market surpluses drive prices down. Again, you're not going to get a mark just for saying inflation falls. You have to give a reason and link it through to demand inflation. All right, and that's it, guys. So please pause this video and go back on any other areas you're not sure about. And then when you're happy with the aggregate demand side, you can move on to the next video, which is aggregate supply. So, thanks, guys.